Anyway, thanks for coming to my talk. I appreciate it. Unfortunately, PHP is not a super sexy topic in the security community, like some of the other interesting tools that have shown up at this conference. But hopefully, I can kind of give you an overview of the current state of where PHP is related to more security kind of topics, and where it's going with the next major version, PHP 7, which should be released. I think it's mid to end of next month. And it's quite a bit of new functionality, quite a bit of new features, all sorts of good stuff. So anyway, just a brief introduction of myself. You got a little bit there. I've been doing PHP stuff for about 15 years, 15 plus really. But I've really only been focusing on the security aspect of it for the past 5 or 6 years. I am an application security engineer for Salesforce, or Pardot is the child company that I work for. And if you're interested, I'm all over Twitter at Enigma, and this is a project, the Securing PHP project is one that I started up, I guess about 2 years ago, providing PHP developers with more resources and more information and kind of more targeted content around securing their applications and teaching them some of the basic concepts, all that kind of good stuff. So, and there's a newsletter that goes along with a Twitter account and everything. So just to start off with a little bit of history about PHP, it's over 20 years old now. It actually celebrated its 20th anniversary a couple of months ago, evolving from the Perl version that Rasmus wrote way back, the personal homepages version. And no, it does not stand for personal homepages anymore. Somebody thought it would be funny to make PHP stand for PHP Hypertext Preprocessor, make it nice and recursive like that. So nice little joke. It is used by over 80% of the web. I think the last measurement was between 80 and 85%. A lot of that is because of WordPress and Drupal. I'm sure you've all have heard of those particular projects, usually with several possibly expletives or, or other interesting things appended to them. Those are the driving force behind PHP on the web. There's a lot of other projects out there that are popular, but those are kind of the two major ones that are really popular. The latest version, the latest stable version is PHP 5.6. I think it's 5.6.14 now, if I remember right, with 7 coming in late 2015. That's next month, basically. They're on release candidate 5 now. I think they're going to do release candidate 6, and then they'll move into the final process for that. And I'll talk about some of the PHP 7 stuff later on. I'm going to kind of go through the current stuff and then move on to that stuff. Again, the PHP 7 stuff that I'm talking about is a little bit more security focused. There's lots of other features that come with it. Lots of performance improvements as well. So it's going to be a great step forward for the language. Unfortunately, PHP 5.3 is still the most widely installed. 5.4 is gaining on it. This is mostly due to a lot of the shared hosting providers that are out there. They put those versions out there and their customers get used to it, and then they don't want to upgrade because they don't want to break things. Fortunately, if you're using 5.4, making the jump up to 5.6 is really not too bad. There's a couple of deprecated things that you kind of have to worry about, but on the whole, it's really not that bad of a transition. Just out of curiosity, who is using some form of PHP applications in their environment? Awesome. Who doesn't like PHP? No, I'm just kidding. Get out. No. All right. So they implemented an official support schedule a while back. As you can see, PHP 5.4 is no longer supported at all as of a month or 2 ago. 5.5 is in security only, and full support is 5.6 is the only one in full support currently. You can visit that URL if you're interested in the current state of it. That red bar moves as time goes on, so you can kind of see where it's at. Again, 7's coming up pretty soon. I do want to give you kind of an idea of some of the community around security in PHP. We've got a couple of folks, these ones up here at the top are a little bit more focused on security in PHP, whether that's the actual language or in the community kind of encouraging secure development. Scott there on the end has been instrumental lately in getting the libsodium extension put into PHP where it's completely supported. There's a few little bug fixes going on right now, but it's ready for use. Anthony was instrumental in implementing the password hashing interface. I'll talk about that a little bit further on. But that just essentially makes it super simple for PHP developers to put in a single function to generate a decrypted password hash from whatever the user inputs. So they don't have to worry about the cost, they don't have to worry about a valid salt. It does all that generation behind the scenes and makes it super simple for the developer to put it in there. These folks along the bottom have given different security talks at different conferences over time. Some of them are more general talks that are just kind of, here's how to write secure code. Some of them are a little bit more about PHP, the language. It just depends. There's been a wide variety of them more recently. Fortunately, it's been picking up in frequency. It seems like there's not a PHP conference that goes by these days without at least one security talk, so it's always good. I do want to talk a little bit about some of the current libraries and tooling. This is just kind of a little bit more around the PHP ecosystem. First off, who that uses PHP has heard of Composer? Or really anybody that's awesome. That's great. That's surprising, actually. I'll speak at PHP conferences and I'll ask the same question and I might get about the same number of hands, which is kind of disconcerting. So just real quick, for those of you that aren't familiar with Composer, it's really the package manager that Pear was supposed to be. The old Pear packages were a little bit more refined down. They had to go through a vetting process and they had to be a certain structure, all that kind of stuff, which was a great idea, but it doesn't really work that well anymore for what PHP has become and where the community is at. With Composer, you can just directly install stuff. Again, you have to be careful with the whole vulnerable components thing, that's in the OWASP list, and kind of do code reviews on what you're using, all that kind of good stuff. But Composer makes it really easy to pull in. It's a completely open source project, and the use of it has exploded over the past couple of years. I think Composer's really only been around for 3 years, 4 years. Something like that, and it's just, it's revolutionized the way that PHP is written these days. There was a huge movement to kind of package-based development versus these giant monolith of, here's a framework, go write your application inside of it. Now there's actually several frameworks that make use of Composer to pull in different components from other frameworks and kind of mash them together and make another custom framework out of it. So the whole community has really embraced it. The packages site is where it pulls all of its source from. You can actually link your GitHub repo directly to Packagist, and so it just pulls it in directly when you install it through Composer. And it makes it as easy as kind of one command. It's either an install or an update. You can do a few more things with it, but those are the two main ones. It'll, like some of the other package managers for other languages, it writes a lock file that kind of locks down the versions that you have installed. So if you run an update, it uses those locks instead of reinstalling the latest versions. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, there's also no vetting of the packages that are on there. So you really have to be careful with what you're using and how the tool is managed, how many releases it has. Somebody joked earlier about how many stars it has on GitHub. That kind of stuff you have to take into consideration. There are some more standard libraries, and I'll mention some of them here in a second, that are widely used, that are a little bit more respected versus just the random one-off input validation library that somebody wrote a year ago and hasn't had any updates since then. There are some major frameworks out there, Zen Framework, Symfony, and more recently Laravel. They've all kind of got a focus on security stuff. The Laravel framework is built on a lot of the Symfony components, and all of these pretty much have security advisories and updates that they'll post from time to time. Symfony and Zen Framework are a little bit better about it. The Laravel stuff, because it's kind of based on Symfony, gets some of that and inherits some of it. But they're usually pretty good about it too. Symfony actually had, I want to say about a year or two ago, they had a fully paid security audit of all of the code in their code base at the time. I think it took them a couple of months to go through all the code. Symfony is not a small framework, but they did have that complete audit. They fixed tons of issues in there, and I believe as of 6 months ago, they got all of them resolved now in version 2. Version 3 is coming out in about a month, which basically is version 2 without some of the backwards compatibility stuff. So taking out stuff rather than adding new features. So good thing. There is a database of vulnerable components that's maintained out there. Mostly it's for larger projects, frameworks, major tooling that's out there. This is for libraries and stuff, not necessarily like for WordPress or Drupal or anything like that. Those projects specifically. They kind of maintain their own stuff. But there is something that hooks into Composer that will actually check that repository and say, hey, you're trying to install this component from Symfony. Well, it's got known vulnerabilities. You might want to update. Or potentially it won't even install it, and it just restricts it completely. So real quick, the Drupal project. I'm going to talk about Drupal and WordPress just real quick, because they are the two major PHP-based projects that are out there. They're the reason that statistic is so high of how much of the web is powered by PHP. Drupal started about 15 years ago. There are several major services and sites that use it, along with just several smaller applications. The whitehouse.gov site, I believe, is still based on a mostly stock version of Drupal. Obviously, they've customized the layout and plugins and all that kind of good stuff. And they actually had the Drupal Foundation come in and harden it, help with the hardening of it as well. They've been renewing their security efforts in the past couple of years. They have a dedicated team of people as a part of the project that actually just review things for security reasons and check the different components of Drupal itself, as well as other extensions that are kind of popular in the Drupal community. They'll actually do code reviews on those as well. They issue security advisories. They have their security email address, all that kind of good stuff, and it goes to that specific team. And like I mentioned, they do the core and contributed components. You can find out more about it if you go to the security team address. WordPress is about the same age. It's a little bit younger. There's about 58% of the sites that use content management systems are using WordPress. The early days of WordPress, it was a little bit more of a kind of a blogging platform, and I think there's a lot of people out there that still think of it that way. But in more recent years, they've really pushed to make it more of a general content management system. A lot of the plugins that kind of implemented that functionality inside of WordPress, some of that functionality has kind of been absorbed by the WordPress core. And so they make it a little bit more generic than just here's text content for a blog post or whatever. They do have their security app. They don't have a dedicated group of people that work on security stuff like the Drupal group does. But they do have a lot of people that are more security minded that kind of go over some of the new WordPress features and new code that's being put in. They do have security advisories that are issued, different updates. They work on the core code as well as contributed code, but not the vast amount of WordPress plugins that are out there. A lot of those, some of the major ones kind of go through code reviews, security-related code reviews, but there are tons and tons of them. I mean, you hear about them pretty much every day, unfortunately. Poorly written plugins for WordPress that just leave a system completely vulnerable and nobody had any idea. I think I forget where I read it, but there was a statistic that I saw that said that probably 3/4 of the hacks that happen on WordPress sites are because of insecure plugins and not necessarily the core of WordPress these days. They are not known for fully embracing more modern PHP stuff. They have a lot of code that's backwards compatible, and so along with that, in the WordPress core, that kind of comes some security concerns about, if you're running this on 5.3 or 5.2, because yes, it does still work with 5.2, even though it's been completely out of service for 4 years now. So unfortunately, they still have code that works with that. So if you're running on 5.2, there's tons of vulnerabilities in there. 2/3 of the issues. Sorry, not 3/4, 2/3, but close, pretty close. So just real quick, some of the libraries and tooling that are out there that have kind of come to the forefront as far as good tools to use. IRC Maxwell, that's Anthony Farrar that I mentioned earlier. He's come up with a couple of different things. He actually came up with a polyfill library, a backwards compatibility library for the password hashing. So you can use it in versions prior to 5.5 that it was introduced. So, try to make that easier for older versions since it's still 5.3, 5.4, on shared hosting providers. The INI scanner, that will look at the PHP INI file and check it against good security practices. So you can verify that you're actually following good practices there. That's kind of something that's been overlooked in the past. A lot of people just, they worry about validating, user input and worry about the application level, but they don't actually think about the server configuration level. There's a lot of default settings that come in the PHP INI that are not secure. So if you haven't checked your INI configuration and you're using PHP, I highly recommend checking that out, or, or at least going through and validating what your current settings are. There's lots of things that can be done to kind of harden it, and it's super simple. Change the file, restart your server. The security checker down there is the one that I mentioned that goes and looks at that list of vulnerable components for like the frameworks and the major projects. That will actually prevent the installation of vulnerable components. So it's pretty nice to introduce in there. The diffuse PHP encryption is one that's actually been vetted by several InfoSec community members, and it's super simple encryption that you can just drop into your application. It's not as full-featured as some of the other ones out there, but the goal there is to make it simple, is to make it easy to just drop this stuff in and run with it. And there's plenty of other libraries out there that are more verbose in their syntax and how they're structured. That last one, Twig, has kind of become the standard for templating in the PHP world. Obviously, you can just use plain PHP and output strings and everything. But Twig does provide context-sensitive escaping. So you run all of your code through the template parsing. It actually does lexing and parsing of the template that you pass in. So it understands if you're calling a variable inside of a JavaScript string that it needs to escape it a certain way versus just regular HTML output escaping. It has all sorts of fun features, and and all of these can be installed through Composer. You don't have to download them and manually include them or anything. Composer Autoload will just autoload the libraries for you. You can just use them that way. So real quick, I'm going to go through some of the current features in PHP. Most of these are 5.5 and above, just because that's the most recent supported version. Obviously, I think it's just in security fix mode now. But so the native password hashing. It's a little bit more user-friendly version of crypt. You could do bcrypt hashing in crypt if you wanted to, and you still can, really. You just have to pass in the right string for the start of the hash. And by default, it is bcrypt for the native password hashing with a cost level of 10. You can configure that cost level if you want something higher. It's just an additional option on the password hashing call. It introduced 3 new functions: password hash, password verify, and password need rehash. The password hash is used to generate the hash itself. You pass in the password string that they give you, and it just spits back out the hash for you. Password verify takes the password string input and compares it to the hash that you give it, so you don't have to do any weird evaluation there. There was a lot of people that were using the triple equals for that, and that's in PHP that was vulnerable to a timing attack issue. So if you're comparing hashes, there's also a hash equals function that's in 5.5, I think, or 5.6. It might be 5.6, that does timing attack safe comparison of strings, hash strings like that. Normally, you don't have to worry as much if you're using the triple equals, but yeah. That password verify removes any of those issues. It does it behind the scenes, takes care of it. The password needs rehash. So right now, whenever you call the password hash function, you can see that you pass in this password default. Right now, the password default is set to bcrypt. But if bcrypt gets broken, if there's a flaw found in it in the future, and they want to say, okay, nobody use bcrypt anymore, we don't want to do that anymore, they can change that password default to something else, to some other hashing algorithm. And you don't have to go in and change your code at all. It just says, oh, okay, that's magically the password default now. That password needs rehash should be called on those old passwords, the old hashes that you have, and it'll say, oh, okay, this doesn't match the right format. So you need to go ahead and rehash that password, and this is just an easy way of saying yes or no, basically. And you can see the password verify is just input password and then the hash password, and it does the timing attack safe comparison behind the scenes for you. It replaces that crypt call up there where you actually concatenated the 2y up there to the salt, and that was how you told crypt that it needed to be a bcrypt hash. It was a little bit prone to user error, and that also allowed you to put in bad salt values. The bcrypt or the password hash stuff generates a salt for you unless you give it one, but by default it'll just generate a randomized salt for you. That crypt function, if you didn't pass a salt value before 5.6, it just didn't say anything about it, which is an awful thing to do. But since 5.6, it now throws a notice to you, and it says specifically that no salt parameter was provided. And so even if you do go back and you use crypt, or you have crypt in your code right now, it'll throw you this notice. And everybody has all the error reporting turned on in development, right? E-all, yes? Yes? Not? Okay, good. Because yes, PHP notices are errors. Those need to be fixed too. Don't forget about those. In 5.6, there were a lot of new updates to the OpenSSL functionality. A lot of new stuff was added to kind of expose more of the base OpenSSL interface. It does verify the peer by default on SSL connections, which was a great major win. It supports the fingerprinting, and the list of default ciphers was updated to the full Mozilla list that was out there. Compression on the connections is enabled by default. You can set the cipher order now. You can get the protocol and the cipher from the stream on request, on each request. The context options are a little bit more forward compatible, a little bit more flexible that way. You can select the SSL TLS version, and you can work with the public key and the challenges and verify those. Like I said, a lot of the base level OpenSSL stuff that was kind of hidden from PHP before is just kind of, it's been more exposed. You can also work a little bit more with the certificate files. You can do them per case rather than global. Before you could only set those values globally. You can actually do them per connection now, per the SSL connection. I think that was it for the OpenSSL stuff. So I mentioned the timing safe hash comparison. This hash equals function is the one that's recommended to replace the triple equals. There haven't been any known exploits for the timing attack on the triple equals, but it is possible. It's pretty hard to do, but it is there. So they dropped in the hash equals. There is also a polyfill version of that, so if you're not using 5.6, you can introduce that into your code base and go ahead and drop a hash equals in, and then if it's actually defined, it'll use the real hash equals, otherwise it uses the code, the polyfill code on there. And yes, triple equals when you're comparing types. PHP is notorious for type juggling, so if you're not using triple equals to compare your stuff and you don't have a reason for comparing it loosely typed, yeah, you're probably doing it wrong, unfortunately. One of the other things that was changed in 5.5 was the deprecation of the /e regex modifier. This essentially would allow an attacker to potentially inject PHP code into your regular expression. I don't really know why you would potentially be using user input in a regular expression, but it was there. So it would allow for eval of that PHP code if that managed to sneak in there. It was deprecated in 5.5, and in the upcoming 7, it's just going to be completely removed. You'll get in 5.5, you'll get the deprecated message. In 7, it'll just I think it throws a fatal error if you try to use it in 7. There was an update in 5.5 for strict session handling. You can use strict mode, which prevents uninitialized session IDs. So if it was given a session ID, it doesn't start up that session with that ID anymore. There's a setting in the INI file that prevents that from happening on the URL, but this just restricts it even more and ties it down even more, makes it more strict. There was a new session started regardless of what was sent in the cookies, but this functionality prevents the session fixation where you're somehow setting a cookie or that session information is set when a user goes to a site and suddenly that session ID because PHP by default just has that PHP ses ID or however it is cookie up there and it's just the hash. So I mean it's pretty predictable. They fixed something a while back where that hash was actually predictable because it was time-based, and the way that it was being calculated, there wasn't enough randomness introduced in it. So if someone had, I think if they had the past 20 hashes, the past 20 session hashes, they could actually predict the next one. So yeah, that got changed pretty quickly when that one was found, needless to say. And if you're curious, if you're curious, you can actually change the hashing method that PHP uses to generate those hashes in the PHP INI file. You can change that hash. It's just a single setting, and you just tell it a different hashing method, and it does it automatically. Obviously, if you already have people with sessions open and you change that and restart your server, it's going to break their sessions, but small price to pay. Okay, so future. Like I said, PHP 7 is going to be coming up here pretty soon. They're on RC5, RC6 will be coming at the end of this month, and then 7, the final release, will be coming next month. There are a lot of things that are introduced in 7, but there are some pretty major things for the PHP language. The first one is scalar type hinting. This does give you a little bit more as far as type hinting on your functions. Right now you can do like array or a callable or an interface, something like that. The scalar type hinting implements type checking on like Boolean, integer, float, string. Unfortunately, to enforce it, you have to turn this on at the top of every file. And it is not inherited, which was a big level of contention around that on the PHP internals mailing list. It's not, in the first versions of 7, it's not going to be something that you can just turn on globally. You have to define that at the top of every file. But you can see this kind of stuff where you could define the user interface for that function, the parameter. That was already there, but stuff like integer was not. You couldn't do typecast for an integer or string or anything like that. That was a pretty major win. And then on top of that, you can also do return types in 7, where you just use this notation right here and define the return type. Again, you have to declare that strict types because otherwise it has no idea of what these return types are supposed to be. I don't think you can use like interface or callable or the other type hinting for classes, namespace classes or anything like that. I haven't tried it, so it might work. But I think those are just the base types for that. It'll throw a type error if that's invalid when the strict mode is turned on. If strict mode is off, it doesn't throw any type errors, obviously. And if the strict typing is not turned on, it's going to coerce those values into what they need to be. Because PHP loves doing that. It loves changing data types behind the scenes, and yeah, it's one of its fun, interesting things. Also in 7 is the native cryptographically strong random generator. This was recently introduced. Well, I say recently, they've been working on 7 releases for a while now. But they realized that a lot of the developers out there were using RAND or MT-RAND or just various kind of hacky methods to generate these random numbers in PHP apps. So they decided we're just going to go ahead and put a cryptographically strong one in, and people can start using that. It replaces RAND and MT-RAND. Those are not going to be deprecated yet. There's no notifications for still using those. But I have a feeling in the future, once this actually gets in and gets more adoption, that those are going to start throwing deprecated notices before too long. So fingers crossed. The functionality introduces those two new functions, the random bytes and random int. There's also a discussion around possibly including a random string as well. So you can just generate those randomized strings so you don't have to do any fancy handling on bytes or anything like that. Right now you would have to get random bytes and then coerce it into a string by doing some manipulation on it. But at least you're based on some random byte information. Previously, the recommended method was using the OpenSSL random pseudobytes method and grabbing those bytes manually and coercing them that way. This just kind of gives you an easier way to do that, and it changes up the sources that these things pull from. I believe it actually goes in reverse order, so it starts with these two down here, like dev-urandom and stuff. And then obviously on Windows it uses, it doesn't have that, so it uses that gen random. And I believe if it can't find a good enough source for the random values, it actually throws an error. It doesn't try to fall back and use mtrand or anything. Excuse me. So and this is going to be the one that causes the most headaches when people update to PHP 7. If anybody in here has been using PHP for any amount of time, you know that things like variables and how variables are interpreted with the curly braces and versus the the square braces, all that kind of good stuff. You know that there's been some weirdness between the different interpretations of it. PHP just tries to figure out the best way to interpret it. In PHP 7, they changed it up so that there's less errors potentially in the variable interpretation. You can see that's the actual variable down there on the end. This is how it used to be interpreted before PHP 7, and this is how it will be in PHP 7. You can see it kind of, like this kind of stuff, it structures it a little bit more so that you're actually interpreting things the same way every time, regardless of how you're calling it. This, unfortunately, is going to break some things out there, especially the ones that use variables, and that try to do any tricky things with, returning like, the function call after the variable name and all that. This also will get rid of the issue where in some functions, if you're returning a value, PHP will throw a, function cannot be used in right context. It'll actually get rid of that kind of stuff because it does the interpretation correctly. It was because of the weird type juggling and how it handled the variable stuff that it couldn't figure out that return value. So it'll get rid of that, fortunately. That's been very annoying for several versions now. PHP 7 also introduces better Unicode support through strings. There's a lot of the functionality that still doesn't directly support Unicode strings. But it's getting better. You can use the Unicode notation with the /u and define the character identifier there. And you can see that it does actually detect the correct string length for the bytes for that particular Unicode character. So it's getting better, but it doesn't detect that there's Unicode characters in there and try to switch it around accordingly. You have to use that escaping syntax. But that's only added in 7. They also changed the exception handling to make things a little bit more consistent. Before there was a lot of different kinds of exceptions that you could potentially throw. If a fail error was thrown and you weren't catching, prior to 7, you couldn't catch fatal errors. It would just show the white page of death. It just wouldn't render, or you'd have stuff in your error log, or potentially dump out an exception if you weren't catching it correctly. The error class, built-in error class, replaces the engine exception that replaces fatal. I didn't do it, I promise. I didn't break it. But that replaces fatal, which means that you can now catch fatal errors as a part of your error handling in PHP 7, which means essentially if you have a top-level exception handler you can define a global exception handler So if you miss something with a try catch or a library throws an exception you didn't realize it would, you can define that global exception handler, and you can now catch those fail errors. So ideally, once you're running PHP 7, if you define that, you won't get any more white pages of death. So that's a lovely major win. Because of how the engine exception stuff is implemented, you actually get a little bit more verbose on how the errors, or what the error type is. You can get a type error, which is an invalid type, string versus integer, the value of the variable. You can get a catchable parse error, so you're not just going to get that random parse error exception thrown when you miss a semicolon or miss a character in there. And then the assertion error is more for asserting values. There's that assert function that's built into PHP that you can assert that a value is the correct type or that it matches the value you're expecting. There was a problem a while back with the unserialized function. If you crafted a certain string, a serialized object string, and it had a destructor method in it, on unserialized, PHP would actually fire that destructor method, because it would unserialize the object, create it as a temporary class, and then pass it through the regular object handling stuff. And so a destructor is always fired at the end of the object being destroyed. Yeah, it makes sense. So in PHP 7, they actually implemented a filtered unserialize. You can configure it in a couple of different ways. You can do the, just generally allowed classes. So you can say, yes, I want classes to be instantiated in here. You can turn it off. Unfortunately, I think the default is true. So it still functions pretty much the same way, but you can turn it off, which is good. Hopefully that will, they won't worry as much about that backwards compatibility break in the future, and they'll swap that around. Or you can specifically define what kind of classes that you want. I don't know if namespacing works in here. I'm pretty sure it does. But you can define a list of classes that you want it to be able to instantiate. If you turn off that functionality and there is a class in there, it actually creates that PHP incomplete class. So you have an object, but you can't do anything with it. You can only look at it, and that's pretty much it. They couldn't figure out a way that wasn't a return null to handle that kind of stuff. So they just made this temporary kind of class thing that you can't call, you can't, I don't even know if you can do, I promise I'm not doing anything. You can't even do any kind of reflection on it or anything like that. Yep, let me be sure here. Okay, hopefully that'll cooperate. I'm not too far from done, so. So that was most of the new functionality in 7. Again, that was more security-focused kind of functionality. If you're interested in everything else that's coming with 7, I'm more than happy to show that to you. I gave this presentation at AppSec a couple of weeks ago, and I actually ended up having somebody from the Wikimedia Foundation come in and ask me about PHP 7 and the benefits of going to that over HHVM. And I'm not sure how many people know the Wikimedia stuff went exclusively to HHVM, that hip-hop VM that Facebook put out. They exclusively went to that a while back, and I think he was slightly disappointed when I recommended sticking with PHP 7 versus going to HHVM. So, yeah. If you haven't tried HHVM, it's an interesting project. It allows you to compile down the PHP code, so it executes a lot faster. It's type safe by default. There's all sorts of stuff that come with that, but it's an alternative runtime for the PHP code. So anyway, why is this important? I gave you some statistics at the beginning of the presentation of how much PHP is out there, and there's more and more growing, and it's constantly growing all the time. There's more and more of it out there. And major projects like WordPress and Drupal and even some of the libraries, the composer stuff that I mentioned, it's not going away. And there's a lot of it out there. I hear more and more companies saying, a lot of them more for internal kind of tooling, but because PHP is so easy to pick up and it's so quick, it's being adopted more widely. And thankfully, due to some of the the newer features that are coming in, the language is getting better. It's getting a little bit more sane than it used to be. It's an uphill struggle to try to dump some of the previous black sheep kind of stuff that the language has had around it. But I think it's getting there. I mean, I think, with some of the new features and deprecation of some of the old crud that's around in the language, it is getting a lot better. So these are just 2 example statistics that I pulled up. It's TIOBE, T-I-O-B-E, index for popularity of languages. You can see that PHP is down there in number 6. It actually used to be in 5, not in this particular one, but it was at 5 for a little while. And then down here is just the usage statistics of web applications. This is not just overall usage, but you can see how large the PHP usage is out there. For a language that is so widely used across the internet in so many different applications, there seems to be this kind of huge gap between security and the PHP world. And that's one of the reasons why I like going to conferences and I like talking about this stuff, because it seems like it always opens at least 1 or 2 developers to, oh, hey, this is great stuff. I really want to start writing secure code. And for the rest, it's good awareness of what's out there. And you invest in that open source security, you invest in a community like that. And if you're one of the people that understands the ways to write secure code, not necessarily just secure PHP code, but writing secure code in general, go talk to a developer, go sit next to them and say, hey, look, you're writing this feature, I noticed that you're writing it this particular way, your logic might be flawed in this particular situation, and actually sit down with them and, don't drop it in their laps, but, work with them and cooperate with them. And I know it's difficult to sometimes step out of that, oh, here's a vulnerability, go fix that vulnerability kind of mentality. But if you sit with a development group, or even just sit in the planning sessions and just say, hey, you're going to be implementing this feature, here's a couple of things to watch out for. And just kind of keep security on their mind and keep it continuous throughout the development process and not a kind of an afterthought. A lot of developers out there have that problem. They think, oh, well, I'll develop it, I'll make it work, and then I'll secure it, which is a terrible approach, unfortunately. But I think with more integration between the security groups and the development groups, kind of meshing those 2 worlds, you can actually get a little bit better results than just trying to say, here's what you did wrong kind of things. So anyway, any questions? Oh, real quick, again, that's my Twitter handle. I'm very active on Twitter, and I will respond to you if you tweet me. You can tweet me mean things, and I probably will still respond to you. So, and that WebSec.io site is one that I've created. It's got some general security stuff, kind of developer-focused again, but it's got a lot of PHP-based content too. Spotlights on certain libraries, just general concepts, best practices, that kind of stuff. So,
do we have any questions? I have a mic.
Are there any good static analysis security tools for PHP?
Right now, most of the static analysis stuff is, the better static analysis stuff is more commercial. There have been a few projects in the past. There was the RIP scanner, but as of 5.3, I think, or 5.4, it got severely broken because of some changes in the language. I actually talked to the guy behind it at AppSec, and he's working on a new version of it, though. And I think he's hoping to have it out within the next 6 months, something like that. That's a pretty good scanning tool as far as static analysis. There's a couple of other ones out there that kind of do randomized stuff. I worked on one for a little while, but free time, stuff comes up, unfortunately. But yeah, most of them right now are more commercial, on the commercial side.
Are there any recommendations of the commercial ones?
I can get you a list after, if you want. Yeah. Anybody else?
Anybody else?
Questions? Yes.
So you mentioned the session issue, where the PHP developers decoded session in a way that was fairly easy to predict, not truly secure way. fact that the new version, PHP 7,
Mhm.
is bringing in an entire library of cryptographic functionality. Did the PHP developer bring in cryptographers to audit the code to make sure that they were actually doing it right?
So are you talking about the random number generator or the session stuff? So the session handling, changing
Not
that.
session handling, I assume
okay.
that's been fixed, hopefully.
Yeah, the predictability stuff, yeah, that was already fixed. I think
But
5.3.
my question is, if they had a problem with such a small item, and now they're providing developers with an entire array of cryptographic functionality.
The random functionality and stuff, right?
I'm wondering if they brought cryptographers in to ensure that what they're doing is done right.
Yes.
And also, I think the issue now that we're seeing is to make sure that nothing malicious was injected into the PHP application to do the functionality or actually secure.
Yeah, they did bring in people to consult on the implementation of the random library stuff. A lot of it is essentially taking the functionality that was already there, stripping it down to make it a little bit easier to use, and then using those known good cryptographic sources like devu random and stuff like that, versus trying to do, like NT-rand, where it was a random kind of functionality that was built into PHP, into the language itself, that didn't use any external sources. But yeah, a lot of that random stuff does expose more of the low-level randomized stuff that has been completely vetted by, InfoSec and cryptography people, stuff like that. Does that answer your question, or?
Is it possible that the crypto functions themselves are coming from a well-vetted library, like a libcrypt or something else that's already, vetted by experts?
I think, I'm trying to remember. I think some of it's based on encrypt. There was a big debate a while back about what they were going to deprecate and what they were going to leave in, but I don't remember the result of that one. So, but it's not. It is from a known source. I know that. I just don't remember which one. Once PHP loads that file, it understands that the type checking stuff is in that particular functionality, regardless of whatever else is loaded and whatever else calls that file. So there is the potential for you to have part of your application being loosely typed and some of it being strictly typed, which is not ideal, but I think the RFC for the strict typing stuff went through 5 or 6 different revisions before everybody finally agreed. Unfortunately, you have to remember PHP is kind of a design by a committee. There is not a one single authoritative source for, okay, we're going to do it this way. Everybody pretty much has to agree. They take votes on functionality. And sometimes the RFCs are actually multiple steps. So they'll vote on certain parts of it to accept certain parts. And unfortunately, that having to declare that at the top of each file was the one that went out over doing it over the entire code base. Like I mentioned, hopefully in the future they will actually have an INI setting where you can turn that on and do it across the entire code base. But because there is a lot of PHP code that takes advantage of the fact that you can coerce the types and do loose comparisons, there's a lot of stuff that would just completely break, unfortunately. I know WordPress and Drupal would massively break if you turned on type checking.
That's your composer. All the packages you're playing from composer, they all have to be PHP 7 to be typed.
Yeah, all those ones, yep.
It makes sense, but.
Yeah, it's a huge backwards compatibility break if they had it in there. Again, it would be optional, but if that was all that was in there, being able to turn it off or on, then yeah, people just wouldn't use it. So hopefully this will kind of get them to piecemeal it out a little bit more.
All right, anybody else?
No?
Great, let's thank Chris with a great round of applause.